Alright, good morning, guys. I literally just woke up. Well, I didn't just wake up, but I woke up this morning, finished read my Bible, and then I watched a video on this YouTube channel called Daily Dose of Wisdom. And it was basically a response video to, let me see if I can find the video. A response video to the assertion that God is evil for allowing evil. And I kind of just wanted to give my response to this. And I think, I don't know, sometimes you can think too hard about things and make the answer more difficult than it really is. But the true answer that I feel like I want to share is that suffering is not an issue to me as a Christian anymore, because God already solved the issue of suffering. God already offered a solution to suffering. And so suffering is not a reason that I would not believe in God. God already gave the solution, because he tells us there is no suffering in heaven. You know, that's what you that's what you have to hope for as a Christian. I think suffering is only a problem to people who are atheists, because they don't have the solution. They don't believe in the solution that God provides to suffering. And so when atheists are speaking about, all of the suffering happening in the world, and they see it as this point of, well, God can't exist because suffering exists. But from the Christian perspective, suffering, God offered a solution to suffering through Jesus, which is why I'm not concerned about the suffering I endure on earth, or people have to endure on earth, because the solution to that is heaven, and God has made heaven available to anyone who puts their faith in Jesus. So, because atheists don't want to accept the solution God offers is the real problem, not suffering itself, because there's an end to all suffering. According to God, according to the Bible, he is going to end all of the suffering, put an end to all of the evil that's happening in the world. God promises that in the Bible, guarantees that all suffering will come to an end. There is no atheist has that. I don't know. I honestly feel like it's kind of pessimistic being an atheist, because I guess atheists put their hope and put their faith in themselves to be the solution to suffering, I guess. But a lot of suffering happens because of sinful desires. Yes, there's natural disasters, there's disease, but war, who starts war? Why does war happen? Because two people can't agree on certain things. Someone's hungry for power and is willing to sacrifice people in their countries to fight for whatever. But war isn't caused by God. That's caused by humans. Humans cause and create a lot of the suffering, and then you're blaming God for the choices that people have made that created and caused suffering. There's people who knowingly do things that cause harm to others, and they don't care, right? So really, I think if you are thinking about it I think a lot of times atheists really just have this kind of know-it-all type of attitude where it's just like they think they have a gotcha for God. They think they have something over God. And a lot of times they think they're better than God, which is quite funny to me because their ideas of who God is does not even compare to the reality of who God is. Like, atheists don't actually they don't understand the goodness of God. They don't understand how good God is, and that's why they're stuck in this mindset of, oh, I don't need God, because they in their heads they think God is down here because they don't understand the goodness of God. And it is kind of sad to see, like, some of the things atheists say or believe about God is just, as a Christian, it's very flawed logic, but I also understand it comes from a place of hurt, because that's the other thing. I think whether or not you believe in God, suffering is going to happen. The Bible doesn't even tell Christians they're not going to suffer. It actually almost guarantees suffering. So God is not, God tells even the people who believe in him that they're going to suffer in life, that it's not going to be, Jesus suffered and he lived a perfect life, right? So it's not like God God promises to end all suffering, right? But suffering serves a purpose. And that's a part of Christianity that I think an atheist maybe is going to have a hard time understanding, because suffering serves a purpose. God doesn't allow suffering for no reason. Like, God wouldn't just say, I'm going to let a bunch of people suffer and for it to serve no purpose other than people be miserable. Suffering serves a purpose. That is why Jesus suffered. That is why we suffered. Suffering shapes you, teaches you, helps you grow, but it also helps you appreciate what you do have. And even in the moments I feel like I've suffered at times in life, I would say, like, being sick, when any times anyone's been sick, even just a cold, flu, maybe you have COVID, would you not consider that suffering? But that suffering was temporary, and when you're not, and when you've been sick and then you're no longer sick, don't you appreciate the goodness of not being sick? So I feel like one purpose of suffering is to show us, suffering allows us to understand goodness. Without recognizing the bad that happens in suffering, you wouldn't appreciate the goodness of health, the goodness of, all of the good things you take for granted. Suffering kind of allows you to not take the good for granted as well, and to appreciate it when you have it. But anyways, I just don't believe that suffering, I feel like suffering is just suffering when you're an atheist, because you don't accept the solution God gives to suffering. And so now you have this worldview of, suffering just exists for no reason. But the problem with that worldview is it still exists. So you're saying a world without God, suffering is going to exist. And it's just like, it doesn't make sense, because it's like you're blaming God, but at the same time saying you don't believe in God, but the suffering doesn't change. The suffering doesn't stop. The suffering is still there. whether you believe in God or not. And I feel like that is why, as a Christian, you still have at least hope. You have hope that suffering comes to an end, because God literally promises that in the Bible, to end all suffering. But you also have, I feel like when you endure suffering as a Christian, it's so much different because you can feel God with you. It's like when I've ever gone through like a very low moment in my life, that's usually when like I'm the closest to God, when God is nearest to me. And that's even like in the Bible, like God is close to the weary hearted, like the people who are like mourning. God says he's close to those in mourning. He's close to those. Like when we are literally at our worst, at our lowest, is when God is actually the closest to us. And so you can endure suffering when you have God with you, there with you to go through it. But I can't imagine, I feel like that's why I'ma always take Jesus. Like, you mean to tell me being an atheist means you still suffer and you have no guarantee of it ever ending? And then also it doesn't even serve a purpose? It's just like you're just miserable, and for what? For no reason? Like, that type of world view, I feel like, to me, is very depressing. At least in Christianity, suffering serves a purpose. And the purpose is to bring you closer to God, but also to help you recognize the good. And why do we know that suffering comes to an end? Because that's what the resurrection tells us. Jesus died a painful, miserable, horrible death. 3 days later, he's alive. Like, the entire story of the gospel is literally about God putting an end to suffering. So, no, as I think, like, the response to, I guess, the original question, why does God create suffering? God didn't create suffering, but he does offer the solution to it. And that is plain to see if you read and understand the Bible, if you study the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And also, I think too, I don't think we understand suffering the way God does. And this is just me being honest, because I've watched testimonies of people, of other Christians who've gone through very traumatic, like some of the worst experiences you could imagine, and share their testimonies and how God was with them through some of the worst possible situations you could find yourself in. And it's just great. It's always amazing for me to see how people can endure situations, like suffering in certain ways, and still, trust God and believe in God. And it kind of like strengthens your faith in a sense. But that's what I'm saying. Like, there's atheists who are saying, well, I can't believe in God because all of these evil things exist. And then you have Christians who've suffered some of the worst types of traumas you can think of, boldly professing their faith in God despite the suffering they've endured. It's just like you have two completely different mindsets about suffering. As a Christian, suffering is a part of your story. It's a part of your growth. And it also is a lot of times what leads people to Christ to begin with. But for an atheist, it's just like there's no purpose to suffering. So maybe because without God there is no purpose. And that's where that makes it almost like circular in a sense, because it's like with God suffering has a purpose, and also there's a solution to it. God also provides the solution to suffering. Without God, you have suffering, no solution, and no reason for it, no purpose for it. So it is miserable to exist in this world as an atheist, because suffering, it doesn't, like, this is the thing. If you really don't believe in God, then that means you don't believe that the world was created, and you also still are experiencing the suffering that exists regardless of you believing in God or not, because suffering exists with or without your belief in God, is the, I guess at the end of the day, the reality. But I feel like with God there's a purpose and a solution. Without God there's no purpose and no solution, and I feel like that's way more miserable of of a mindset than, I don't know. Like I said, as a Christian, I don't know. And it's like I understand where atheists come from with that thought train, because it comes from no one wants to see people suffer, right? And we all have this understanding. But I also, that's why I said, like, we don't understand suffering the way that God does. And I think God helped me kind of understand that a while ago. Like, suffering serves a purpose. Like, God wouldn't allow suffering if it didn't serve a purpose, but it serves a purpose for those who love and believe in God. But suffering for those who don't believe in God keeps them from God. So it's like there's suffering that God allows people to go through because he knows it's going to bring them closer to them. And then there's the suffering that the devil throws at people to keep them away from God. And I feel like a lot of atheists are on the side of enduring the things that keeps them away from God, and then they never get the solution, and they never get the peace, and they never get the understanding that the suffering that they went through was to actually benefits them. And people don't realize that, and that's like a mentality that you only have, I feel like, really as a Christian. Like, when you have this mindset that suffering is not to hurt you or to harm you, and you only get to that mindset by studying, like, the suffering that Jesus endured brought about, like, Jesus literally suffered for the benefit of humanity. He endured suffering. Like, the suffering that Jesus endured served the purpose of allowing us. He took the punishment of sin for the entire world, even though he lived a perfect life, so that we could literally have a life without suffering. Is that not crazy? I mean, I don't know. That's why I've said it's like the answer to the question is simple, but it's not something that a lot of people want to hear or accept. But like I said, every person is going to experience life based off of their worldview. Like, your worldview ultimately shapes how you experience life. And I feel like a Christian worldview gives you hope. It gives you endurance. It gives you like a purpose to a lot of problems that life brings. Whereas I feel like And this is why I said most atheists, in my opinion, it's not that they don't believe in God, it's that they reject they reject God. Ultimately, they're like, they don't want to believe in God because they have their own ideas about who God is and how things should have been. And I just think like there's so much points of contention around who God is, how he created the world, what certain people believe it should have been. But it's like the reality of the world is all that we know. We only know the world that we exist in. It's like talking about a world that doesn't exist doesn't solve anything. Well, God should have created a world without suffering, and he should have done that. And the answer to that is God did create a world without suffering. That's what heaven is. But anyways, that's just my thoughts on it. Like I said, the answer to suffering is the solution. That's really just what I'm going to say. God already created the solution to suffering, and that is why a Christian perspective is not focused on suffering anymore, because Jesus already solved the issue of suffering. That has already been solved in the Bible. But without Jesus, you really don't have that hope. And that's why I think a lot of people who reject the Bible and reject God and reject Jesus, they have this mindset of, God just created this evil world, yada, 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 because they reject the solution God gave for suffering. So you can't, and it's like to still blame God for suffering, even though biblically God solved and already gave the solution to suffering. I feel like it's just, I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it. It's just like you're arguing from a place of non-acceptance at this point. It's really just like you don't like the solution God gave. You don't want to accept the solution, but you're still mad about the suffering. But you didn't want to accept the solution. So you're blaming God for your rejection of his solution because you want a different solution, but you don't have the control to make that. I don't know. I really just think you're arguing with your rejection at the end of the day. If you don't accept the solution God gave for suffering and you want to try to create your own, I don't know. It's like I don't know what to really tell you at that point, because I feel like a lot of times, like I really think it does just come down to atheists don't like the idea of God because they are aware that God is greater than them, but they feel like they are greater than God. So they've put themselves on a higher pedestal than God, but the God that Christians believe in is the God who created all things. And when you're aware that you serve a God that's greater than you, you don't put yourself above God. But atheists, in their mind worldview, mindset, whatever, have this belief that they have higher moral standards than God, which is crazy. But also they try to I don't know. It honestly seems like they try to belittle God or shrink him down to not being the creator that he is. And it's just like the actual when you actually think about it, like just from a logical perspective, take your emotions out of it. If God exists exactly as who he says he is, the creator of all things, you really can't argue with the person who created you, right? If God created every single thing on this planet, including us, and God says specifically about humans, he created us in his image, right? Not the animals, not the plants, not the trees, not the earth, but specifically human beings were created in the image of God. What does that tell you? Like, it's just like the created arguing with the creator, like believing you know more than the creator is crazy, to be quite honestly. Just from a logical perspective. I'm not talking about, whether or not you believe it. I'm just saying logically, it's not possible for the creation to be greater than the creator. But I also think too, like, it takes someone, like, the person who created you has to know more than you do. From a logical perspective, in order to create something, you have to know what you're creating, right? And I think that's where it gets like muddled, because it's like you don't have respect for the creator, but also you don't believe in the creator. And then it's also just like the worldview of an atheist to me is really sad and depressing. It's just like, to me, it's very meaningless. But that's just how, I don't know, how I understand the world. A world without God to me has no purpose, has no meaning. It's just like you live, you're alive. It's like, I don't know. I really can't wrap my brain on a world without God. That's the only thing that makes sense to me, is God. Because I don't like believing my life is meaningless. And that just goes back to me having existential crises since I was like 12 or 13. But yeah. I feel like to not believe in God means like you just live life every day. I'm laughing because I'm like, you just live life every day with no, like, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that means like people don't create their own purpose or create their own meaning. Like, you can certainly create your own meaning of life, but I feel like there's only two options. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. But I also would strongly argue that there's a lot more evidence for the existence of God than there not being God. Based on even just understanding creation and design. Like, that's why a lot of scientific evidence is now, like, the more science discovers about the world, it's like the harder it is to really argue that everything was created from nothing, out of nowhere, at random. Because there's a lot of design, there's a lot of intricacies, there's just a lot of, like, I honestly just don't, I mean, this is a whole nother argument, but the fine-tuning of the universe and how specific things have to be in order for any of us to even exist it's almost like it was intentional. You know what I think is so funny too, and this is just me sharing my like thought process. I'm like, if something impossible exists, if something that shouldn't be possible exists, right? Based off of like a mathematical equation, right? When you are saying like the chances of something existing is like 1 to the millionth or whatever to the nth degree, where it's like basically impossible. The probability of any of us existing is pretty much impossible, yet we all exist. When the impossible is possible, would that not mean that it was purposely created? Like, random chances doesn't create impossible things, right? The probability of anyone existing is like so small. It's like nobody should exist, yet we exist. So when the impossible is possible, does that not make you think like someone specifically, where am I getting at? I'm losing my train of thought. I'm so sorry. It basically just makes you think like, if the chances of you existing are pretty much impossible, how does that not make you think, well, my existence has to be intentional then? Because something that shouldn't be possible doesn't just exist out of nowhere. Like, there was something specific. Somebody specifically created you, right? I don't know. That's just how I think, personally. Like, in order for that, like, that small chance of you existing is not going to come about on accident, basically. It has to be intentional then. If the chances of your existence is that small, to me, it would be reasonable then this was intentional then. Your existence is intentional because the chance of it happening at random is pretty much zero, which means it's not random. I don't know. That's my logic. If that makes sense, like this video. Basically, it's like saying, and I remember, and I do think like in the scientific world where randomness is kind of the belief system, is why people will argue some pretty dumb things, like if you randomly put chimpanzees in a room for infinite amount of time, eventually they'll be able to write, like whatever. And I said the problem with with that logic is the things that get written are intentional. They're not written at random. So to even say that it's possible for somebody to create something that was intentionally created at random doesn't make sense logically. Like, when the person who wrote the Da Vinci Code used logic, intelligence, their brains to create it, and they didn't create it out of randomness. They intentionally created and designed and wrote and studied or whatever. It took an intelligent mind to create those things, a mind that could reason and logic. But for someone to say it's possible for a chimpanzee at random with infinite amount of time to also create that is, to me, not founded logically. And that's an argument. That's a real argument someone's tried to make. And I don't remember. Don't think they said the Da Vinci Code. They said like a Shakespeare play or something. If you put a chimpanzee in the room and gave them infinite amount of time, that is possible. But the only way you could believe that such intentional things could come out of randomness because of just quote unquote infinite time, is because you believe that order comes out of randomness. And that's just not something I believe. Order comes out of intelligent design. Like, nothing that we've created was not intellectually designed. computer programs are intellectually designed. Someone had to code that program. It's just like nothing great that's been created has come out of randomness. So to assert that it's possible for order and chaos, functionality, and design to come out of random is something that only an atheist will ever argue, because it doesn't logically follow. You would only think like that because you don't believe in God, but you still believe that the world we live in that has order, functionality, and design exists out of nowhere and at random with no intellectual thought behind it. Which you could only believe if, like I said, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyways, that is the most illogical thing I think I've ever seen someone assert, but I understand that it comes from the belief of the logic of order and design and functionality comes out of randomness, because they want you to believe a big bang just happened and created everything. Where did the bang come from? Where did the matter come from? Where did all of this come from, right? It's just, I personally can't believe that everything just comes to exist out of nowhere and nothing for no reason. And the Big Bang on it in and of itself still doesn't explain. There has to be a beginning. And there also has to be a eternal force. And that is exactly who and what God claims to be. No one else is claiming to be that, by the way. Like, I don't know. I don't know who else, what other God claims to be the beginning and the end. I mean, I honestly think too, if you study religions and someone said, I'd rather believe in the Greek gods and all of these, I'm like, none of these gods assert that they created the earth. None of these gods claim to be the beginning and the end, or to be the one who created all things. That is, to me, well, I haven't studied all religions, so I don't know. Maybe there are other religions who claim to that, but I also think like God in the Bible claims to be the one true God, the one and only God, and that everyone else is just a false god. And also, funnily enough, the Bible does mention Greek gods, but it mentions them as being the false gods that people used to worship. And that's also true. But anyways, this video is really just me sharing my thoughts on, the atheist mindset. Or I shouldn't say every atheist. I don't know what every single atheist believes. But specifically, I think his name was John Fry. I don't know. I'll link the video I watched down below so you guys know what I'm responding to. But essentially, his belief that he doesn't believe in God because suffering and evil exist, in my opinion, is not really... well, I'm not going to say it's not, well, it isn't a fair, it's really not a fair argument, because it takes away the fact that the atheist person rejected the solution God gave to evil and suffering in order to still try to call God evil for allowing suffering. But the reality is, God is not evil for allowing suffering, because he offers a solution to evil and suffering. It would be evil if suffering and evil just existed and, there was no end to it. If it was just, this is how the world is going to be forever. But that's not actually who or what God says in the Bible. So it's kind of like a false presumption that's even being made about God, because this atheist person rejects or doesn't like the solution God offers to those things. But it's just like you're really not arguing against God. You're arguing against your rejection of God. Or I should say your rejection of God and your rejection of the solution that God gave to those things. At least if you're arguing specifically against Christianity. Now, if you're arguing against God and other religions and in other things, I don't know where to tell you with that, because I'm not sure what other religions believe about God. But I can specifically tell you, at least as a Christian, that the suffering that Christians, or the suffering that people endure in Christianity, has a purpose. And also that God has already offered a solution to suffering and promised to end all evil and suffering. So that's how you know God is good. I'm just like, it's not like I wouldn't, like, I don't know. I really just think you have to think a little bit and not think about things like hard. I often think sometimes people complicate things too much, which is why you have to kind of take a step back sometimes and recognize, like, I guess, like, it's like what this person is arguing is not the reality. Like, the God that you're arguing against is not the God that Christians believe in. You're arguing against your own ideas of God based off of your rejection of God, and also the rejection of the solution God gave to those problems. So you have to first reject God, reject the solutions to suffering and evil that God gave, in order to even have the mindset that He has about evil and suffering. Because it's just like, I don't know. It's not a mindset that most people have about the world, in my opinion. All right, that was it.